Let's talk first to Elizabeth Giroux, a US market research expert and polling expert based in California.
I mean, it's hard to know where to start because normally there's sort of some hope for the losing party. There's some ounce of consolation. And yet, I mean, you tell me, but when I looked at the polls and the results coming in earlier today, the Democrats seem to have lost everywhere amongst everyone. Good evening.
Good evening. It's a pretty sweeping loss for the Democrats. That is true. But I think I can help shed some light on some of it. I've been interviewing. I do qualitative interviews too, and I have been interviewing both sides for quite some time on a regular basis. So I don't know if you're interested in, trying to figure out what the voters were telling me leading up to this that might, impact.
Please, what is it? I mean, help us understand what's driven this success once again.
I mean, it's complicated. There are a lot of reasons, but I think if I had to rank my top three, the first would be sentiment or feelings about the US in general. Okay. The second would be just the major issues. And then the third would be, I just want to talk about women. All right. So sentiment about the state of the US. The majority of Americans right now think the country's on the wrong track when we poll them. Okay. And Joe Biden's approval rating is 37%. It's actually 78% among Democrats and only 5% among Republicans. So that explains to you the level of division, right? But in total, his approval rating is 37%. So any candidate walking into that, right, would have especially if they're tied to that administration, would have a hard time. So this is sort of the setup, right? That's sort of the issue, the context of how people are feeling right now in the U.S. Going to the bigger issues, ranked 1 through 3, the economy is number 1. Protecting democracy is number 2, and immigration is number 3. So Donald Trump was clearly stronger on the economy and on immigration. Protecting democracies, Kamala Harris was slightly ahead of Donald Trump, but when I talk to Republicans, protecting democracy means something totally different than when I talk to Democrats. They both care about it. They want to go about it in a completely different way, right? So in terms of the major issues, Donald Trump was ahead. And you just said that really well. The prices of gas and food and housing, that's what they mean by economy, inflation and those prices, right?
But just to touch on that before we move on to the others, Elizabeth. I mean, Donald Trump did a good job of focusing on that. Is it a fair critique to say that the Democrats and Kamala Harris didn't, that they weren't talking about those issues and how they'd address them enough?
She talked about it. I don't know if it was enough. I mean, she had 3 months, right? But when I talk to people who were voting for Donald Trump, it's as simple as when he was president, I had more money.
Right.
And that's it. It's as simple as that. Yeah. And so they don't right now. They're not taking into the full context COVID and that we've recovered quite well. If you look at us relative to some of other nations, that none of that is being taken into context. They're going to the store and they're saying prices now are at least 20% higher than they were before. I can't afford groceries. I can't afford housing. I can't, And so it's as simple as that when it comes to economy.
And yet the first time they elected him, of course, inflation was nowhere near what it is now. When he beat Hillary Clinton, I think, let's of course look at the fact that people's lives and incomes have got worse. But there's something deeper, isn't there, Elizabeth? There's something about lack of jobs. There's something about identity being lost. There's something about people feeling they've been ignored and not heard that really that inflation taps into, but is a sort of deep, long-lying resentment that he has managed, to his credit, to really exploit.
He's managed to exploit it. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what side you're on, Joe Biden didn't do a great job of communicating where we were economically. And when our citizens were saying, hey, we're hurting, the Biden administration said, but the economy is actually quite good. Inflation is going down. And so they felt unheard.
Yes.
And that's never good. Right. So it was kind of a mistake. It was almost like you could call it a PR mistake. I don't know, from the Biden organization, which then Harris inherited.
And you touched on, you wanted to talk about women voters who have proved quite
pivotal. I think it's really important. So there was a measure that we did at Ipsos that said, we need a strong leader to take back the country. And 58% of all U.S. Voters said that that was important, that they agreed with that. 62% of women said that. So I always found that quite interesting, that they wanted a strong leader to take back the country. And when we ranked who's stronger, right, it was always Donald Trump was perceived as stronger than Kamala Harris. And there's a lot of reasons for that, including women and men and how we perceive them and, all of that. We thought that women were going to turn out in higher numbers. It turned out that 52% of white women sort of turned out for the Democrats, and Biden had 57%. And we were projecting actually that it would be much higher than before, given reproductive rights and all the other things. So that's something we need to look into. And I have not heard a lot of media coverage of women and the role of women in this election and what actually happened. And then the third thing I'll say is that when I was interviewing qualitatively, I did a lot of interviews where people were afraid that people would not vote for a woman. We've never had a woman president in the US. And that kept coming up as like, oh, other people might not vote for them. But it came up as she's not qualified. And when you press them on her qualifications, it ends up being about, you know what, I'm just afraid that countries around the world won't take a woman seriously, especially countries that do not value women, right? I don't know how much of that. I'm going to continue to dig into that. I don't know how much played a role, but it under the bucket of, let's explore women, there's a lot of nuance here that I think affected the result.
I think you said, Elizabeth, that potentially, in its early days, but potentially racism and sexism maybe were factors in this election, specifically in regard to Kamala Harris.
It's a hard thing to talk about, and it's really nuanced, and some people don't even really know that that's what's happening.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They just feel like she's not prepared or whatever, right? But it could just be their constructs of what power looks like or what, and so I think qualitatively digging into that is going to be something I do. It'll be really interesting.
It will. Keep us posted on that, because it's a fascinating element of it, and I'm sure it played a role. The question is, of course, how big. Elizabeth, just lastly, I mean, I appreciate it's very, very, very early days indeed, but just your initial thoughts on where the Democrats go from here, because twice in the last 8 years or so, they have been found to be out of touch with the very people that traditionally they're supposed to be representing.
Yeah, I think the Democratic Party needs to take a very serious look at what happened here. And I think if I were a strategist working for them, I think the most important thing is to help make sure that they listen, that they truly listen to actually the people who didn't vote for them, in order to come up with the right strategy moving forward. I mean, that would be my advice. And I don't think, I don't pretend to say this is what you need to do right now. I think the first step is really listening to why people didn't vote for them and then coming up with a strategy from there.
Sounds like a good idea to me. If they'd done more of that after 2016, perhaps we wouldn't be in this mess. Elizabeth, thank you very much indeed. Elizabeth Giroux.